And we're live. Gosh, didn't see that even pop up. And here we are, another month, another Men as Allies conversation. And wow, there's been a lot of conversation today, guys. A lot of very different perspectives, different reactions. Mark, you have certainly set, I don't know, have you set the cat amongst the pigeons? Or no, you just put a post out that actually, I don't know, created ripples that I'm not sure I expected, but there we go. But it just, I mean, I guess we were just chatting before we came on about the fact, if anything, it just shows how complex this is. And it's not just a conversation about behavior out there, because it lands differently for different people. And so, yeah, you know, and I think it touches on identity, it touches on so many things. And so, yeah, I mean, so I don't know, tonight isn't about perfect. Tonight is about actually having a conversation. So I don't know about you guys, but what have you noticed on the conversations today? What's well, welcome, first of all, welcome everybody else. So, and sorry that Dan can't join us today. But hey, it's just the three of us this evening.
Yes, it is. Well, it's good to be here, Laura. I suppose, and we were talking about this beforehand, and I think what that post did, it was obviously an image that caused people to react to the image, and potentially maybe not even read the actual post piece of the image. But and that's the reality, we react from our own experience, and we react from our own biases and from our own perspective. And if we take things personally, well, then we have to defend ourselves in that way because we've taken them personally, as opposed to really what the post was. And if we go back, and I've mentioned this before, will be about my wife saying doesn't feel safe, and me telling her, you should feel safe. Well, why do you not feel safe? There's no reason not to feel safe. And her having to explain to me that that's her experience, and me not accepting that that's her experience, and telling her she should feel safe because she's safe, because you're with me right now, you should feel safe, you know. And her point being, it's not with you I don't feel safe. You know, and I like that. Like, again, I was down the beach this morning at about 5 to 6, and I was thinking the same thing. It was in the half light, you know. It was the light was coming into the sky. It was still a little bit dark, but I'm here, and I don't have to think about my safety for being here. Do I need to? Is there a risk to me? As some people like to point out in the post, you know, well, men, the same kind of men would attack men too. And yeah, that's possible, but I don't have to think about that, and I don't think about that because I think, well, if there is a danger, I may be able to handle it. We do all have this hyper-inflated sense of our own ability to deal with a physical situation too, which is part of the male ego. But then, I know my wife wouldn't have been there. So, like, I think for people who are taking things personally, that's a reflection of themselves and their experience, as opposed to the post being a reflection of my wife and the female experience, or an attempt on my part of a reflection of it. I should be clear.
I think it's right. It's the lens through which that they're seeing the world, and I think that's the thing with everything, isn't it? We all see the world through our own lens because of the experiences we have. You know, Matt, I'm sure you probably have some stuff because of the lens that you see the world, and it'll be marginally different from. I mean, there's going to be core themes, I'm sure, but from what we see.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously see it through the lens of somebody with a relatively youngish daughter who is a firebrand, a firecracker, who I'm intensely proud of and scared of in equal measure. And just, yeah, in all honesty, fearful of the world that she's coming out into and how she's going to experience it. Because at the moment, she has no fear, which is great, but also that is worrying. Because she's coming into a world where, frankly, to your point, Mark, she's going to end up, I believe, scanning constantly for the threat and the risk. And will she be out at 5:50 in the morning on a beach? Probably not. But yeah, I did find your post incredibly interesting, because I fundamentally come from the position of men don't get involved because it's not because they're indifferent, it's because they're sort of uncertain. What do I do? What role do I have to play here? And I do believe that that's the majority of men, but certainly your post showed with a few people that it wasn't so much an uncertainty or even an indifference. It was sort of, well, this is not my problem. You can't guilt trip me about what is an entirely small proportion of men that create this problem. So it is a challenge, because it's about, I think, trying to help the men who aren't the problem, as we've spoken about before, realize that it is still their problem, because we all have daughters, wives, mums, friends who this does affect, and doing nothing isn't the solution. So we have to be more engaged, and that's not to say that we have to become, as we've sort of said before, have a go heroes and this sort of thing. That's what we've talked about in this group before, isn't important, but it's just about knowing that little things matter, little interjections, little conversations, little bits matter, and trying to, I think, help the average man who isn't the problem see that they are potentially part of the solution.
And I guess I've gone to a place of it. Is it that, and is it also understanding? And I think this is for women as well. I don't think this is men in isolation, but understanding impact and how what might feel completely normal for a man doesn't feel. I mean, and it kind of goes to your point, Mark, about what should make your wife feel safe. I'll give you an example, a very real example from the weekend. So, as I alluded to, I drove to Paris this weekend. However, when I got the other side of the channel, I had my two youngest nieces in the back of the car, busy on their devices while I popped to the loo. I didn't lock the car because the alarm would go off and all hell would break loose. I came back, it was very bright. I went to get my sunglasses out of the boot of the car. I opened the boot of the car to discover an illegal immigrant curled up in the boot of my car with my suitcase and my rucksack. To say that I was alarmed was an understatement. My nieces hadn't noticed. I did scream. It wasn't what I was expecting. I mean, if we'd arrived in Paris with him still in the boot, he would have been sorely disappointed, because we weren't going towards London, we were going to Paris. But, and he wasn't aggressive. There was nothing aggressive about what he's doing. Clearly, in that moment, all he wanted to do was get in a British car and come back over to London. But in that moment, he had completely not understood the impact it would have on me as a woman who considers herself quite, worldly wise and having traveled places and all the rest of it. And, it does, you could argue I shouldn't have left the car open, but, literally I was 3 minutes, 4 minutes tops. And in that moment, and there were other cars around, everything. But I guess it's made me think about, in his innocence, in the bid to do something that mattered to him, he had failed to recognize the impact that it would have on me. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't that, it was all very much, he was probably more frightened than I was, believe it or not. But I guess he hadn't really understood the impact he would have on a woman just suddenly being slightly alarmed. But yeah, so I guess there's a question in that for me, is there something around people not really noticing the impact that they have, that we just assume that what we're doing is okay, and never question it? Don't know.
Well, first of all,
I've completely thrown it
I didn't know where that story is. Did not expect that part of that story to go in that direction. Something I was thinking about earlier, Laura, and it's like, how do women know to be afraid? Yeah. And there was a study, a really interesting study, right? Going to the animal kingdom for a minute, right? And it was of, they were looking at fledgling birds, and they were showing them different things, and the birds would find nothing of it. But then they showed a silhouette of a hawk, and they all reacted, cowered, ran for cover, right? They had never seen a hawk in their life before. They were fledgling chicks, I can't remember of what species. But when the silhouette of the hawk, because it was in their psyche was to be afraid of this thing. And is that the level we've got to? Is it in the female psyche to be afraid in that space? Is that what we've done? So that's how you know to be afraid, you know?
Yeah.
And when you say, do we know the impact? No, of course we don't know the impact. Because we don't know it, we don't feel it, we don't understand it, and we don't listen. Sorry?
I know, I agree. And I think that's, you know, it's such a good point because, you know, I mean, obviously, well, not obviously, Professor Fiona Vera Gray talks about the safety work that we do as women. And she'll say, you know, she spoke to so many women who didn't even realize what they were doing because it becomes so much part of normalized behavior that they didn't deem it as safety work. And then she pointed out some of the sort of basics of what, you know, they were doing. And they go, oh my God, I'm doing all of that all the time, you know, because they've already got this level of fear ingrained that they don't actually acknowledge that it's fear. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I'm not sure, really, to be honest. Yeah, and also just sort of reflecting on your experience there. It is an odd one because, look, if I think about myself, I have done things out of self-interest that I haven't considered the reaction of the other participant, the other person, particularly if they're female. And so I think you're right. I think a big part of the issue is not understanding the way that your actions that they might make the other person feel. I think that is an issue because I recognize it. I'm guilty of it myself. I've never got into a lady's boot before. I've got to be honest. That's
I mean,
a new one on me.
I have to say, I was like so surprised.
But it's a good analogy, really, isn't it? It is a good analogy because, yeah, poor guy was just desperate for something for him, not recognizing the impact that's going to have on somebody else. And you know, that I do believe is part of the problem. I think also just sort of coming back to the post that Mark made, it got me reflecting. Just seeing those micro bits of sort of almost sort of aggression in the comments that Mark got back about, oh, don't tar me with the shame and this sort of stuff. And it got me thinking about, well, yeah, we're not going to get men to the table with shame. Not going to work. It's just not the way. But how do we get them to the table? How do we get them involved in the conversation? Because we've seen, and as we've said before, you know, when we try to organise active bystander training, no, I don't need that. No, I don't need this. No, I don't need that. Which I believe that we all do, but it didn't land. So I do think it's about kind of finding, like calling men in, actively inviting them in with the notion of responsibility. Here's what to think about. Here's what we need from you. Here's, you know, a role for you to play. I think that's possibly the way forwards because, yeah, as we've seen with Mark's post today, and it was not Mark's intention at all, but the moment some element of shame comes in, oh, how dare you, and total back away.
No, and I think you're right. I mean, there's sort of several strands that my mind's gone to, and I think, you know, bear with it as my curly whirly brain goes off in the various myriads that it does. But I guess going back to my man in the boot of the car and going back to kind of the comments that you've just both made, for me, it's like, actually, that's a very human experience that we don't understand because we all have needs and values in the moment. We can always be, shall we say, a little bit selfish because we don't realize the impact that we have on others for what we've done, because in this guy's instance, he was so desperate to get over the channel, the fact that he was actually potentially going towards Paris as opposed to London, you wouldn't know. But that aside, his desperation, that was his need. He hadn't thought about the impact. That's not a man-woman thing. That's a human thing. And so maybe there is a recognition that actually that's something. It's recognizing that that's just being human. And if we can understand the need and the impact that we have as people, then actually that is a learning that we can learn together. So that's kind of where one of my thoughts went to. And I think, and Matt, I know, well, we've all talked about this before, but definitely out of some of the work we've done locally, this idea that if we want men to step up and to be part of the solution and to make women feel safe, actually the irony is we have to make men feel safe first. And at the moment, there is so much noise out there that's saying, you're the problem. It makes it even harder to step in and take that first step into the space, because there's so many out there going, I'm damned if I do, I'm damned if I don't. So where's the common ground that says, if I go just a little bit forward and take a step forward, that I'm not going to be damned if I do and damned if I don't, because of the narratives out there. And maybe that's half the challenge. And so where is that middle ground that says, it's safe for men to step forward? And, back to where do you start, Matt? And I think for me, and there was a brilliant post by Richard, I can't remember his name, where he said, we're expecting, he didn't talk, I think he did talk specifically about men, but I think it's true of anybody, but we expect men to meet us where we want them to be rather than where they already are. And I think that's always a really big ask, particularly when somebody is already feeling vulnerable. So he was, I'm sure it was Richard, was saying, why aren't people going into barbershops and talking to men there rather than expecting them to step into a space where they don't know anybody, and it's like, well, what are we going to say? Whereas if you're clutching something, it's why probably pub conversations, yes, we talked previously about pub conversations worked, because effectively you're there with a pint in hand and you can have a conversation, or you could just stare at your pint. There's something to do at the same time as talking. So it's kind of, is it because we're expecting them to meet where we'd like, or we have to flip the conversation in order to get that first step forward? I don't know. Thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are I personally put a great deal of societal ill on the fact that the pub is dying, because it's community. I think men need that community, and men need that safe space, and the fact that it's not what it was is a very sad thing. And it again, I'm coming back to Mark's post, the notion that who would keep the women safe if there weren't men around. This is the question, I think, isn't it? It's around, well, what is man's role? Because that in itself is quite an outdated notion, that the man is there to provide the woman with safety. Some women who beat the out of me, it's no longer this typical gender roles that once existed. So yeah, and I think this is, as you said before, this is part of the problem. Men not knowing, not feeling comfortable, not understanding where they stand. What is my position in society today? What is my value? What is my worth, really? What do I bring? And so, yeah, this is where that notion of shame just doesn't help in any way, but also where we have to engage them where they're at, and discuss this notion of what it is to be a man in 2026. and help men understand where they're at and their role.
What's very interesting about that, Matt, I was giving a talk for a construction company there last month, and it was on well-being. And I had about, how long did I have? I had about 2 hours. And I did, at the start of it, a piece on shame. Because I was just trying to highlight statistically, men in the construction industry are 3 times more likely to commit suicide, to die by suicide than any other industry. Like, why is that? And I went into the shame cycle around it and have to be tough and be a man, all these kind of pieces. And that's something I do in the talk of vulnerability that I do in companies, or I get booked to do it in companies, and then it gets cancelled because no one wants to turn up with it. Because who wants to talk about vulnerability in this space? Like, it's not easy. And so I did that talk, but there was actually a number of women in the room. And so I was talking to the boss afterwards, and it was the boss was a woman, and she was talking about some of the stuff, because I gave free form responses and how crude it was, and she wasn't happy with that. And I was like, okay, I can understand why they did that. It's men, they do that, but I can remove that aspect. She said, but also we have more women starting in construction roles, not in the admin, not in the office, but in construction roles. So I said, okay, fine, I'm doing this again tomorrow. I'll rework this so that I bring it in. So I was like, well, how do I bring in safety for women? And how I brought in safety for women was around not being safe to speak up, not being believed, not in these spaces. And I thought the contrast between the shame cycle for men and the fear cycle for women was extraordinary. It was 2 completely different spaces that neither of us could read. There wasn't a middle ground between them, like, and be very hard to understand. And it kind of ties into all of this conversation. But then when we're thinking about, well, what can we do different? And you know, to that point about calling people in instead of calling people out, you know, how do we want to lead? How do we want to be? I get that we don't know what our role is per se as a provider in those kind of pieces, because that has been obfuscated and that's evolving as we go on. Like, you know, my father never cooked a dinner his entire life, you know, and there I was making another crap dinner this evening, you know. It's evolved as we've gone on. Not that I'm good at it either, just to be clear. So is there that need to ask ourselves, right? Well, how do I want to lead as a man? How do I want to be in the archetype role of a man? You know, in that space of standing up and leading, and who do I want to be in that space? Because if that's what's more important, because that's a leader, and where are our leader role models that we look to right now in our world? Do we so few of them? Look at all our global leaders and look at what they express and look at who we idolize. You know, so where are the leaders that are doing the right thing and standing up for doing the right thing? Because that's the calling in we need as much as possible. And that's the examples that we have to try and leverage off and follow.
And I think that, you know, for me, what I'm hearing is that really knowing what matters most and what you want, effectively, you know, say, this is what I want to stand for as a person. And I don't think that, again, you know, I'm going to flip it and say, I don't think that's a man or a woman thing. I think that's a human thing, that actually, you know, we need to get better at saying what I'm going to stand for, the person I want to be in this world looks, sounds, is like this, and that's what I want to, you know, to be. Because if we're standing that is kind of our guiding, I don't know, some would say that our North Star, gives some other term for it, but, you know, effectively that's our compass as to keeping us moving forward with integrity, having respect, etc. So, but I guess that's the bit for me, is that I don't know whether there's enough of that understanding going on, and therefore it's too easy to step into this criticizing or this narrative that pushes back on you know, about identity, because people don't really understand what identity is. Because identity isn't the label, it isn't the environment you are in. Identity is ultimately the very essence of who you are and what you stand for. I don't know. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, society right now makes it very difficult to grasp identity, I feel, because society values controversy. That's what gets, you know, again, as per Mark's post today, you know, he wasn't meaning to be controversial, but if somebody just looked at the picture, controversial stuff came up, and he's got 20,000 impressions on his post. You know, society today rewards controversy. I don't want to make any kind of political statement here on the performance of an individual or otherwise, but I reflected back on the last election, and one of the main sticks that the other political parties were beating Keir Starmer with was, oh, he's a bit boring, he's grey. I'm like, frankly, after what we've had before, that's not a bad thing. Like, a bit of quiet professionalism. I'm not saying whether he's done a good job or not since then. It's a entirely different point, but it just goes to this point that the media, that the societal expectation is for big out there commentary, big personalities, and people get lost in that.
And I think that's the thing. And I'm that last week I was struck by an individual. Now I'm going to say his name wrong. Bear with while I quit. Delicious Aurier. Am I pronouncing that correctly? I'm going to put it in the chat because he. I was super impressed by this advert. This is the kind of person that we need to. So hopefully this will work. No, let me put it in the chat on LinkedIn. Hopefully that'll work. Who knows? We'll see. But this guy basically was an Olympic boxer. He had pursued for 8 years this pursuit of money, believing that was going to fill this emptiness that he was experiencing. And he realized that actually it was going to kill him. So in the end, he stepped back and said, I'm not doing this. And it's only the interview was really quite impressive. His he's only 28, but he made a very conscious decision to step away from this boxing career. And all credit to him. These are the voices that we need to hear. And it was such a powerful story. And yet, I mean, it was on primetime BBC News, so that was a bit of a first. But even so, we don't see enough of these stories. Just want to seemingly copy and paste the link, but hopefully it will have gone into the chat. I don't know, from StreamYard. I will definitely post it afterwards because, as I say, he was. I fear that I would have ended up being a world champion, but a very depressed, sad, and miserable world champion. And I wanted to be pull out before I, boxing exposed me for the emptiness that I had. I turned pro for the money. I needed the money, only to realize that money gives you a little bit of happiness. It really does, but it gives you zero fulfillment, nothing. You feel nothing. So, he very openly says he worked for years to step, and that was his idea of, being a man, that was how he was going to do, but he himself challenged that narrative. And so is it that we need more people like that stepping into the space, challenging the standard narratives to give people alternatives as to what is possible? I don't know.
Well, that's a brave call to let go of something you spent your life doing, because you can see that it won't actually bring you fulfillment, because most of us spend our lives doing something that we don't enjoy because we get used to doing it and it's comfortable and all the rest of it, Culturally, it works. The amount of times, I don't know if it's the same in the UK, but certainly in Ireland, the amount of times somebody will be talking about someone and they'll always say, oh, they've done well for themselves, because that seems to be the measure. You've done well, fair play to you, you're great, you've made money, therefore you are worthwhile. So it's very brave to do and step away. And, is the point that we lack courage,
Yeah.
If I go back to that vulnerability piece, and, the idea of being vulnerable is thought of as weakness. And it's that Brené Brown, kind of concept of vulnerability. But to be vulnerable is anything but weak, to be open. And like we talk about vulnerability in modern leadership, we talk about vulnerability in all these spaces. And I think vulnerability is simply better termed authenticity. It's better termed, living a little bit more real and accepting the consequences, for standing up and leading in the right way. But it takes courage. It takes real courage, and that's the hard part, because you have to go with what is probably against the grain to do that.
And I think that's it, and I think sometimes we think it is potentially big steps that we have to take to work against the grain, but in actual fact, it's not in the extremes. It's in the small steps that we do every day, and taking that first step. I mean, I guess that's the question: is what are the small first steps that we can all take? I mean, and maybe it is just understanding and having greater awareness of the impact that we have. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I read a really interesting article this week. It was Simon Squibb, who is a local to us here in Tunbridge Wells, and also a previous local of mine in Hong Kong as well. And he was commenting on the whole manosphere thing that's going on right now. And I think one of the points that he made links exactly with your point, Mark, and your descriptor about this boxer, Laura, because I think a first step that he calls out is a good one, which is to ask the men around you to talk to them. What are their values? Get them to actually look at what their values are, because these kids that are getting influenced towards the manosphere, there's a lot of noise there, and there's a lot of I'm making money to the boxer point, money. And it's only when you actually pause and take a step and question things, what are my values, that you can start to then go, well, to his point, do your values involve you being under house arrest for 5 years?
Yeah, exactly. No.
No, they don't. But it's that sort of pausing to kind of reflect that we don't do enough. It's what led me to burnout, was the fact that I didn't pause to reflect. I think that in itself is a positive first step, is to sort of think about, what are my values and what does that mean?
Yeah. And to put it into the wider context, kind of, it is what do I want to stand for? What will I not compromise, for a wider situation? And once we're aware of that, and I think there were a couple of comments on Mark's post about, having awareness, and I suppose that's the same thing as understanding the impact that we have in some ways, because they're so closely connected. But I think that's, for me, it is, those are where the real opportunities, because there was lots of conversation about, it's such a small percentage. Well, no, actually, it's everybody's responsibility, men and women, to have those conversations, to build understanding, to have the conversations where, what your wife is saying, no, I don't feel safe doing that. That's, I would think twice about doing that, because we don't know what we don't know. And equally, as you say, Matt, to be aware of what matters to us, because that makes it easier for us to go, no, I'm not going to tolerate that. No, that really is a no from me, and do something about it. But if we don't know those values, first of all, we can't say no, we can't step in, we can't do it from a point of strength. And therefore it's too easy for us to just step back and not say anything. And that's just as true for women as it is for men. And I think women need to step in as well to do some calling out, or calling in, of some of the women who can equally, be just as bad in terms of, not making other women feel safe. I think it's a collective responsibility, personally. And I think if more people are aware that it's the collective responsibility, those conversations are to be had together, then, you know, maybe we have a chance to change things. Because I don't think it's any one person's responsibility. Both of you are eager to
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's almost a whole separate conversation, a whole separate LinkedIn Live around this. But to your point around a joint responsibility to call in, I think, as I sort of alluded to earlier, I think part of the problem is that men don't know their role. Men are afraid to do the wrong thing sometimes. They're not sure what's required. So if there is and again, this isn't to shame women when I say this, but if there is a greater groundswell of female voices talking to their partners, talking to their husbands, talking to their sons of, you know, this is what we'd really value from you. This is where we'd like your help. This is where I'd like to call you in and ask for your support and ask for your help. Then that is a good first step, because yeah, at the moment, caring plus uncertainty, which is where it sits a lot at the moment, is just leading to silence and inaction.
Yeah. No, I agree. Well, you look very contemplative there.
Yeah, well, I was thinking to, you know, Matt used the word community earlier on in this discussion, you know, and I know what you're trying to do is create a community where you are in Tunbridge Wells. And what are we trying to do here online except create a community too, in terms of thinking about this and talking about this. And what's very interesting, we all know of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Everyone is familiar with that, and you know, self-definition, and you need food and shelter, and the way it goes up, you know, and all the pieces that we need. But what's really interesting and really unknown about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs is there was a piece taken out of it, because it's mainly been promoted through the US, and the piece that was taken out didn't suit how they wanted people to think. And what they took out of it was community and the necessity for community in the hierarchy of needs and how we operate that. Because we are, for a million years, we were a tribal creature, you know, but now we've become much more individual, and you know, some people won't even speak to other people at all. Like, life is online, and you know, you go home and you stay in your house, you don't know who your neighbors are, etc., etc. But we are best in community. And what we're really trying to do is we're trying to go back to the world where we built a community that people could feel safe in a community. And like isn't it lovely the way you'll see someone who might have special needs challenges, and how a community will wrap stuff around to help them feel safe and feel secure and feel welcomed in a space, right? You know, why is that not all in all that we do in a community? Why has the individual need come to such a point that it's more important than community, you know? And I think that's, and again, like, you know, to the point of where fucking social media posts are just, you know, argument, because it's saying you're not in this community. This is my community and you don't belong in this one, you know, as opposed to that we want to call people in. And is that the overarching need of calling people in? Is because what are we calling them into? We're calling them into community. That's what we're calling them into. And let's even break that word out further. What does community mean? It's common unity. That's what it is. Common unity. We have a single purpose and mission to try and achieve something and create a space we can all have unity around together. And I think that's really the call in, and that's where we have to build.
And to do that requires conversation. That requires a willingness to step in and seek a level of understanding, you know, and a curiosity to hear all sides. And I think for me, that is probably the biggest first step, is actually to step into the space with a level of curiosity, to actually, you know, you don't have to agree, but to be willing to step in with an open mind of curiosity is at least a starting point to making change happen. Well, guys, as ever, you know, we could carry on for probably a heck of a lot longer, but I'm sure everybody has got other things to do this evening. Thanks, as ever, to your thoughts, perspectives, and look forward to seeing you next month I think I worked out it was the 12th of May. But have a great evening, and I will see you all next month. Take care.
Thanks, Laura.